Okay. All right. I'm Emily Cotta. I'm Caroline Drury, and this is our project. We basically discovered the connection between the outcome of sports and domestic violence. So specifically, we chose to research how the wins and losses of the LA Lakers affected the rate of domestic violence cases in LA. We then compared the domestic violence cases in LA to New York City. We chose this topic because it was reported in England that the outcome of the World Cup resulted in a rise of domestic violence, and we wanted to see if that was similar in the US. And our third point was we just kind of wanted to see if there was a correlation between the frequency of losses of from the Los Angeles Lakers and like compared with the frequency of domestic violence calls. And then we also included data from New York City or domestic violence rates in New York City to compare with the Los Angeles domestic violence rates. So for our downloaded data set, we went to this website here, and it had LA Open Data, and we found a data set from all the domestic violence calls from 2020 to present. And this was the hardest data set to find due to the size requirement, and it was the hardest to clean as well because of it was very large. Then for the first web requirement, we chose an HTML, and we got that from the landofbasketball.com. And from the table on that website, we knew we could get that data through web scraping. And then for our third piece of data, JSON file that includes the frequency of intimate partner violence, family violence, and domestic violence in the different areas of New York City. Obviously, these are just examples, not the full data set because it is very large. But for example, you can see the Bronx and basically we drew from the item tag, which represented the amount of cases, and the count representing the frequency of those amounts. So next we've got our data cleaning process. For our downloaded data set, we chose the data CURD, crime code description, victim sex, and premise description to make a very large data set smaller and just the information that would help our research. We also just wanted the data from the years of 2020 and 2021 and took out some empty strings and wrote it to a CSV file. For the HTML data cleaning process, we scraped using Beautiful Soup, and we took just the date and outcome of all the games. And in this data set, there are some inconsistencies which we cleaned and exported to a text file. And then for our third web requirement, which was the JSON file, we collected the data using tag objects, item, and count, and then multiplying those to the total amount. And we were able to pull out the type of domestic violence and the location of that along with the amounts from the JSON. And so our first insight, the goal of this insight was to compare the outcomes of the LA Lakers games and the date of domestic violence calls. So we basically drew out the month and the year of the game's outcomes and the domestic violence calls. And by merging the columns together, we had to rename them so that they had the same name so we can merge them together. And the data showed that there were primarily intimate partner associated domestic violence calls during the time period in which the lost their games, which could possibly indicate a positive correlation between the amount of losses by the Lakers and the number of domestic violence calls in Los Angeles. For our second insight, we wanted to compare the number of female victims versus the number of male victims in the domestic violence calls. We thought this was important because we wanted to focus on violence
on wives by husbands, because typically men are the ones watching sports games and who would react from the outcomes. And we found that there were significantly more female victims than males. And here is the our first data visualization, a pie chart that can visually show that there was significantly more females, which supports our use of the data set in the domestic violence calls, because there's so many more, 77.5% versus 22.5%.
And then for our third insight, the goal of this was to the crime rate between LA and New York City, since there would be a similar rate, or relatively similar rate, since they're both popular metropolitan cities. However, we kind of were surprised by the frequencies, but I think that is due to the fact that the domestic violence cases that we recorded as a frequency for LA was pulled from only domestic violence calls and not necessarily all of the like homicidal cases in LA, just domestic violence homicides. Whereas the New York City database that included all homicides during that time period. So we were pulling from a much smaller data pool with the LA data frame, which makes sense, which is why there could possibly be a discrepancy. Regardless, there were still 33 domestic violence cases involving murder, in which some may have resulted in a Lakers or other sports teams' loss. And then the second visualization, based on Insight 3, we did a bar graph, and clearly you can see that there were far less homicides than in New York City. But again, that's probably because we were pulling from a lot smaller data set. So. And then Insight 4, the goal of this was to display the types of crimes from LA domestic violence calls and their frequency. And by doing this, we were able to see that most of these, like the highest frequency crimes were involving intimate partner, either simple assault or aggravated assault, compared to other crimes like vandalism or theft. And so, again, this is consistent with our claim that because there were like 20,000 cases, 20,000 plus cases of these, there could be the odds that it may have resulted from a sports team's loss, like the odds that a sports team's loss may have resulted in domestic violence could be greater because there were so many cases. And so, yeah. And then the third visualization, which was based on Insight 4, just kind of depicts the vast difference between the frequencies of like intimate partner assaults and other cases like theft or burglary and stuff like that. And you can just kind of see how big that was with the bubble chart. And so, yep, you've got Insight 5.
For Insight 5, the goal was to compare the number of domestic violence calls during the LA Lakers basketball season and outside of the season. And it was kind of interesting. We found that there was about 4.7 more calls during the basketball season than outside of the season. So yeah, like 8,000 or 7,000, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it was pretty much the same amount of time in the year. And for 4.7% more, it is more likely that those calls could have came from the result of a game. Overall, we conclude that the outcomes of the LA Lakers games does have a positive correlation with the domestic violence rates in the United States. And that's because multiple dates of the calls correspond with losses. 4.7% more calls were during the season as compared to out of the season. 77.5 victims were women, and intimate partner crimes were way more prevalent than others, than like theft in LA.
But we could not make a definite conclusion if the domestic violence rates connect, since there was like a discrepancy between the data pools, and just kind of we're pulling from a more specific data pool with the LA domestic violence rates compared to the New York violence rates. But throughout this project, we learned real life implications of what we did in class. So like doing pandas data frames and NumPy and all of that, we were able to use real life data and make connections between two statistics. And for example, we did stuff with the datetime module, a bubble chart using the Plotly graph and using plotly.io to write the Plotly graph to a separate file. And the greatest challenge as a team, we would probably say was surprisingly the first phase, since it just took a long time to find, particularly like the very large data frame to fit the requirements. And it took a lot longer than we expected. So yes, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.